Vegemite on toast for breakfast is the best. No, it's not. Peanut butter on toast for breakfast is the best. Clearly. It's Vegemite. It's obvious. Vegemite. Salty, yum, Vegemite. You can't be serious. Peanut butter has that wonderful little mixture of the saltiness, the peanutty, a little touch of sweetness in there. It is so superior. Wait a minute. Both of you are wrong. It's muesli. Muesli is clearly the best. Okay, so what am I getting at? I'm getting at the idea that conversations with differences of opinion are difficult. And conversations about differences in faith ideas are even more difficult, even more complicated. So much so that pretty much these days, we kind of avoid even having those discussions when we have these differences of opinion, differences of point of view. I think it's related to even broader issues about why people don't talk about faith in general in our various Australian cultures. We're scared of conflict. We're scared that because these ideas go to the core of our being, that people do have different points of view and that will cause arguments. We want to avoid arguments. The problem, of course, is that it's actually healthy for us to talk about our differences, to talk about our different theological ideas. That's how we learn from others. That's how we learn to appreciate others. It's often how we learn to understand our own point of view more clearly if we have to think about how we would say it to someone else. In fact, Paul is pretty clear on this, isn't he? He talks about the idea that we should be able to make a good account of our faith. We should be able to talk about our faith. I do remember as a young person, doing evangelism training and working out my 3-minute kind of testimony that I could slip into conversations wherever it would fit. I guess I've kind of moved on from that these days because you realise that sharing your faith is not about having some practiced little chunk of knowledge that you download on people when they least expect it. Instead, we think a little bit about, once again, Paul, preaching at the Areopagus and his sermon where he uses the example of the unknown God, the statue that was there in the square. Now, there are a lot of things we can learn from the way Paul does that. But one of the things that sticks out to me is just the idea that how we talk about our faith is not just a matter of how we want to put it, but it's always helpful to think about who we're talking to and think about how they'll hear what we're saying, not just what we're saying itself. Okay, so if we take that as read, that talking about faith involves not only talking about the thing that we want to talk about, but also thinking about how it will be heard by other people, then there are some things to take account of. One of the things that I've noticed in my time around the church, and especially working on the edges of the church, working with high school students for 25 years or so, teaching RE, was that often it's not the content of faith that is a problem when you have these conversations. The people that I would share about faith with, they were actually interested in what faith was all about and the content of faith. What could sometimes be a problem was not the content of the faith, but how some people talk about their faith, how they talk about faith, how they share about faith can get in the way of good faith conversations. And I think that has relevance for whenever we talk about faith, not just with people who are learning about it for the first time, but also when we have differences of points of view on theological issues. Okay, so what can we do about this? Well, one simple thing to begin with is to be aware of the jargon that we use when we talk about our faith. Now, Christians have a lot of jargon, a lot of technical language. You could call it that. That's a nicer way of saying jargon. Jargon sounds like a negative thing. We have a lot of technical language. There are particular things we talk about, whether it's grace or sacraments or whatever it might be. We have a lot of jargon. Now, the problem with that can be that when I use a particular word, whether it is grace or whatever it might be, the person that I'm talking to, they might know that word, but they might actually have a kind of a different understanding of it, a different perspective on that word. So thing number one to be careful of is just to take the chance when we're using this technical language, which is important to our faith, it describes important things, but we should take time to make sure that we kind of get on the same page. So when we talk about a particular thing, we ask in the group or the other person we're talking with what they understand by that word. In the good old RE days, with Year 11 students, that was the group that I taught most often in those 25 years. We would do that old activity, you know, where you get students to draw God or to draw the God that they didn't believe in. So everyone would have to do something. Anyway, have a look now at a few of these pictures that students drew. Now, I've just grabbed a random selection of pictures. These aren't unusual pictures, they're just a random selection, and have a look at the kinds of ways that God is pictured by these students. There are some more traditional ideas influenced by, well, we don't know, their family background, actual attendance at church possibly, but most, by far most, are pictures that draw on all kinds of other imagery, whether from movies or TV, whether from imagination, whether from discussions that these young people have had, wherever they might be. Ultimately, the point is, we can't take it for granted that even when we use the word, something as central to our faith as God, that the people we're talking with have the same idea as we do. Now, if we're talking within the Christian community, you might think, oh, well, I can make some assumptions there, and surely you can. There are some central things that just about all Christian people would hold in common about God. But it's helpful to acknowledge, even from the start, that there may be differences here. It's just good to acknowledge that we're not talking about faith just to impose our view on someone else, but that we're actually talking so we can hear from other people. And this dialogue idea is an important and crucial part of good conversation about faith. It doesn't mean that we think our point of view will automatically be changed just because we hear someone else's point of view, but maybe we should, firstly, be willing to learn from another person and appreciate their point of view, and maybe acknowledge that God might want to change us through the conversation we have with another person. Okay, thing number one, be aware of jargon, be aware of getting on the same page as the other people we're sharing with when we do that. And that can be a useful learning thing all in itself. Thing number two and three are two simple language techniques that once you grasp, really, in my experience, improve discussions about faith, whether that's with people who are new to faith things or people who are experienced in the world of faith too. Okay, so the first of these two things is this thing called owning. Now, you may have heard me talk about this before. It's so simple. When I own a faith statement, I simply use a sentence starter like, I believe, or it seems to me, or in my experience, even maybe I think. I do think the I believe one is a kind of more significant. It's more significant to say I believe than I think. But anyway, when we own our theological statements, our beliefs, by using those kind of sentence starters, it does something significant. Suddenly, if I hark back to my breakfast example, it's not about, say, two people talking about their opposite points of view, but doing it in a dogmatic way as if Vegemite is the only possibility. Vegemite is the best breakfast food. Peanut butter is the best breakfast food. Instead, once we own statements like that, I think that Vegemite is the best food to have on toast. And someone else says, oh, well, I think peanut butter is the best. Now, you might think we're still having an argument here, but when you've begun your sentences with I believe, I think, and so on, what you've actually done is acknowledge that your point of view is not the only possible point of view. You step back from the dogmatic position that says there's only one way to think about these things. And that's really important. That's really crucial. Now, that might be hard for us to get our head around. We might think, oh, well, my particular belief about baptism is the only point of view, it's the best point of view, and so on. Infant baptism, believer baptism, adult baptism, whatever it might be. But ultimately, we've come to a particular belief about those things based on our reading of Scripture and our understanding of tradition and our grasp of reason too, just to mention all three parts of the Anglican kind of stool idea. But that's just where we've been brought. And it's possible that someone else has been brought to a different place by reading Scripture and by thinking through the tradition of the church and by using their reason as well. Maybe we don't like to acknowledge this, but generally on these theological issues, there are other positions. And for each of these positions, generally speaking, people are able to justify these on the basis of Scripture and tradition, their use of reason and so on. So, owning, I believe, I think, it seems to me, in my experience, we own a particular point of view, and as soon as we do that, we acknowledge that the other person or other people in a group have other points of view too, and it almost automatically invites other people to say, oh, that's what you believe? Well, here's what I believe. I believe, and then someone else can do that back to us. And suddenly, we're having a dialogue. We're learning from another person about what they think. We've had the chance to share our ideas. We can think through what we're doing, and so on. This is owning. Now, yes, I said there were two language techniques. Owning is the first one. The second one is similar, but different. It's called grounding. Now, if owning is the kind of personal version of this, I believe, grounding is the more macro point of view, when we attach a belief statement to the group of people who believe it, or to the source for that belief statement. So we might say, many Christians believe, or most Christians believe, or some Christians believe, depending on what the particular statement is that we then complete the sentence with. And as I said, we can use grounding to attach a particular belief to its source, which might even just mean saying, in 1 Corinthians 13, it says, blah, blah, blah. So grounding is helpful too, in a different way, because it enables significant learning, because you know where a belief has come from, where an idea, where a particular part of Scripture, a verse comes from, and that's helpful too. And some people have said, oh, well, how do you know which to do, whether to own or ground? Once you have a go at it, it starts to become quite obvious what's appropriate in any given moment. So what does using owning and grounding do? Well, I've already said that it encourages dialogue. I've already said that it allows for other points of view. It means we're learning from each other. It means we can actually put these beliefs out on the table. We can actually talk about them and get into the nuance of them, rather than kind of having this us versus them dichotomy where we never talk about these things because we couldn't do it peacefully. Owning and grounding means we can talk about our different points of view and do it peacefully too. Now, I do want to mention just a couple of problems that can come up with these two things, just things to be careful of. I have heard before someone say, you might have heard this too, the Bible teaches blah, blah, blah. Now, there are various things that most Christians will say are central to what we believe as Christians, and you might think it's valid to say the Bible teaches. Generally though, when I hear people say that, generally it seems to me, oh, like I've owned this, it seems to me that people say the Bible teaches when they're actually talking about a particular point of view on which there are other points of view possible. So it might be more appropriate to say, the Bible teaches me that, and then share what we're going to share. The Bible teaches me, rather than the Bible teaches, as if there's only one possible reading of this. By the same token, the other potential problem is a thing I've heard where someone says, most Christians believe, and then they finish that sentence with a particular belief. And what's actually happening is they're talking about, once again, a thing on which there are potentially other points of view. And it's not necessarily the case that most Christians, if we want to get into the maths of this, believe that particular thing. Now, we don't want to get into quibbling too much about exact numbers of how many people do this or that, but we should just be aware of the thing that sometimes can be behind that, which is that, well, it's possible that some people might just want to back up their own agenda by suggesting that most Christians believe a particular thing, when that's not necessarily the case. I'm sure we don't want to be doing anything underhanded like that, so I'd suggest refraining from that where there's some doubt about it. Ultimately though, I have found the use of this owning and grounding is super useful. I found it super useful when you want to share your faith with people who've got not much idea about faith stuff, partly because it just calls you into dialogue with someone else who can then say, yes, I agree with you, oh, I've got this issue, I've got this question, and so on. So in a sense, the use of owning and grounding, and thinking about the jargon idea too, it's a kind of evangelism training. If people are shy about sharing their faith because they're worried about feeling like they'll be perceived as brainwashers or Bible bashers or so on, well, if you use owning and grounding, it's almost impossible to be perceived as a Bible basher, as a brainwasher, because you're just trying to enter into dialogue with another person, not using kind of dogmatic assertions that suggest there's only one way to think about particular things. It's our fear of that reaction that will be perceived as Bible bashers and so on that turns some people off sharing their faith at all. And yes, it means we have this silence in various Australian cultures about religion because we don't want to be perceived in that way. So I think this owning and grounding stuff is great. It enables us to have these conversations and do so just as a natural part of the unfolding of relationships that we have with people. And that's in terms of people who aren't part of the church, say. But within the church, using this owning and grounding means that we actually can learn from each other. It might be a thing that could go some way to even, dismantling some of the, what would you call it, factionalism that sometimes seems to rear its head in the church. I'd love to see that stuff go. I'd much rather a church where we learn from each other, where we acknowledge that we have different points of view, but we see the ways in which God has led us to these different points of view, that we see the ways in which these different points of view have their strengths that we can learn from, and we see that our own points of view might be softened by this dialogue, or as I said, we might actually learn more about our own point of view because we discuss our points of view with other people. So I affirm the owning and grounding. You can see that I'm sold on this stuff. Can I suggest that you give it a go? Just experiment with using owning and grounding. I believe, or some Christians, many Christians believe. At first, it can feel unusual, but if you just get into the habit of doing it, it becomes easy, second nature. And ultimately, I think it just feels to me like a kind of a thing that's part of how the kingdom works. Different people being faithful to God, different points of view on some things, but valuing each other, learning from each other, all towards doing God's mission in the world. Thanks. If you have any more questions about the ideas that I've shared in this video, feel free to send me an email here. Thanks for your time. I hope this has been helpful. And let's chat more. I'll see you at formedfaith.org. Thank you.